It was around 9 p.m., not too late, but dark enough to make the quiet roads feel a bit eerie. I was driving home after my shift at the factory just outside the city. The roads were dead quiet, like they always were at that time. It's mostly farmland out there, so it's not like you see much traffic anyway. I was tired and ready to be home, but my gas light came on, so I had to stop at this little gas station in the middle of nowhere. The place was practically deserted, just a couple of pumps. As I was filling up, I noticed this car pull off to the side of the station. It didn't come up to the pumps or anything, just stopped in the shadows, with its headlights off. Nobody got out. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were checking their phone or something. But as I kept pumping gas, it started to feel off. Why stop there if you're not getting gas? I told myself I was being silly and kept going. Then, out of nowhere, their engine revved loudly, enough to make me jump. I turned and glared at them, more annoyed than anything. But then I noticed they still hadn't turned their lights back on, just sitting there in the dark like that. It gave me a bad feeling. I finished up as fast as I could, got in my car, and pulled out onto the road. That's when their car started up again. At first, I figured it was just a coincidence. They had to leave too, right? But when I slowed down to let them pass, they slowed down too. That's when I started to get nervous. I sped up a bit, and so did they. They were tailing me, and I had no idea why. It was terrifying. The road was empty, just fields and darkness. If anything happened, there'd be no one around to help. After what felt like forever, I finally reached the edge of the city. The streetlights and buildings were like a lifeline. Then I saw it. Lights up ahead. A shopping center parking lot. There were people and cars there, and it felt like the safest place in the world at that moment. I headed straight for it, hoping they'd back off. Sure enough, as soon as I got near the lot, they slowed down, then turned right, and disappeared. I pulled into the parking lot and parked, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they hurt. I was too shaken to think straight and didn't even get their license plate. I just sat there trying to catch my breath. Even now, I can't stop thinking about it. What were they trying to do? Why were they following me? I don't have any answers, and honestly, I don't want to know. I just hope I never run into them again. It was a late evening in the fall, and the sun had already set, leaving the sky dim with just a hint of light. It was chilly, and I figured I'd go for a quick walk before it got colder. The streets were quiet, just the crunch of leaves under my feet and the occasional gust of wind pushing them along the pavement. I'd always liked walking in the evening. It felt peaceful. But tonight, there was something different. Something that made the air feel heavier. As I walked, the temperature seemed to drop even more, and I decided to head home. On my way back, I passed the entrance to the trail that runs through my neighborhood. It's a shortcut to a small park nearby, the kind of place where kids play during the day but feels a little creepy at night. That's when I noticed him. A man was standing right at the entrance to the trail. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just out for a walk like me. But something about the way he stood there, completely still, gave me a weird feeling. He wasn't moving at all, just standing there, staring straight at me. I kept walking, trying to act like I hadn't noticed him. But as I got farther down the street, I couldn't resist glancing back. He was still there, but now he had turned slightly, like he was watching me. My heart started racing a little. I picked up my pace, telling myself it was nothing. People stand around all the time, right? Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, and sure enough, he was walking now. Slowly at first, but as I quickened my steps, so did he. At that point, I wasn't just nervous. I was scared. My house wasn't far, so I focused on getting there as fast as I could without outright running. The whole time, I could hear his footsteps behind me, steady and deliberate, matching mine. Finally, I reached my driveway. I practically sprinted up to the door. When I finally got inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it as fast as I could. I stood there for a second, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, and I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was all a coincidence. Maybe he wasn't even following me. But then I made the mistake of looking out the window. He was standing at the end of my driveway. He wasn't walking anymore. He just stood there facing my house, completely still. I could barely see his face in the dim light, but I knew he was looking straight at me. I crouched down a little, trying to stay out of sight. But then he did something that made my blood run cold. He leaned forward, tilted his head slightly, and started whispering. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but just seeing his lips move like that, it was enough to make me freeze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just watched as he stood there for a moment longer, then finally turned and walked away, back toward the trail. Even after he disappeared into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might come back. I double-checked all the locks and sat up in bed that night, jumping at every little sound.
Last fall, I decided to go on a solo hiking trip. I'd been feeling burned out and needed a break from everything: work, social media, the constant noise of daily life. Fall is my favorite season, and I couldn't resist the idea of being surrounded by the golden and red leaves, breathing in that crisp autumn air. The plan was simple: hike during the day, camp overnight, and just enjoy the peace and quiet. I packed light: my tent, sleeping bag, some basic gear, and enough food for the trip. The hike started off great. The trail was beautiful, with trees lining the path and leaves crunching under my boots. It was one of those perfect fall days where the sun was warm, but the breeze was cool. Every so often, I'd stop to snap a picture or just take in the view. By mid-afternoon, I reached a spot where the trail opened up, and I could see the valley below. The way the sunlight hit the trees made everything glow. It was stunning. I lost track of time, just soaking it all in, and realized it was getting late. The sun was setting, and I needed to get to my campsite. The spot I chose was in a small clearing surrounded by trees, far enough from the trail to feel secluded, but not so far that I'd lose my way. I pitched my tent as the temperature started to drop. Once my tent was set up, I built a little fire and ate dinner. It felt so peaceful sitting there in the quiet, with nothing but the crackle of the fire and the sound of leaves rustling. When the fire started dying out, I decided to call it a night. The temperature had dropped even more, and I was ready to curl up in my sleeping bag. I crawled into the tent, zipped up my bag, and lay there listening to the sounds of the forest. It wasn't completely silent. There were a few rustles here and there, probably just animals moving around. It was normal, and honestly, kind of comforting. I fell asleep pretty quickly. At some point in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Everything was dead silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. That silence immediately felt wrong. Then I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the steps were too deliberate. Slow, steady. Definitely not an animal. They were getting closer. My stomach sank. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. For a moment, there was silence again, and I started to convince myself that maybe I imagined it. But then I heard breathing. It was low, heavy, and steady. Someone, or something, was standing right outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My mind was racing. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, creeping around someone's tent? Then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like fingers dragging along the side of the tent. My skin crawled. And then, a voice. "Are you awake in there?" The voice was low and raspy, almost like a whisper. I froze. My heart was racing so fast I thought whoever it was might hear it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just lay there, barely breathing, hoping they'd go away. The silence stretched on forever. And then, finally, I heard footsteps again. This time they were moving away. Slow and deliberate, fading into the distance. I didn't move for what felt like hours. When the sun finally started to rise, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked the same as the night before, except for the footprints. They were everywhere, circling my tent. I packed up my gear as fast as I could and hiked straight back to my car. I didn't stop to rest or look back. To this day, I have no idea who it was or what they wanted. And honestly, I don't think I want to know. I haven't gone camping alone since, and I probably never will.